In addition to announcing a fresh round of tariffs on auto imports that are going to hit next week, U.S. President Donald Trump threatened to impose large-scale tariffs on Canada and the European Union if they work together to retaliate. Well, for his take on the threat and how Canada should respond, we have reached Mark Camilleri. He's the president of the Canada-EU Trade and Investment Association, and we've reached him in Hanover, Germany. Thank you so much for making time for us, Mark.
Thank you, Natasha. Great to be here.
Mark, I'll ask you for a favor, please, because the speed with which the news is coming at us, I think many of us could be forgiven for missing the story altogether. So remind us, what is President Trump saying to both Canada and EU about these tariffs and if we end up working together?
Sure. Well, Trump made it known through his Truth social media post that he did not appreciate Canada and the EU working together and trying to impact any do any damage to the U.S. So that's surely must be seen as a threat for Canada and the EU not to be working together and coordinating any responses to the proposed Trump tariffs.
In the meantime, how has the Canadian government, even though we're in the midst of a federal election, the government responded? How should they respond?
Sure. Well, I mean, I'm not privy to the discussions of the Canadian government, but I know there's a very healthy and ongoing dialogue that takes place between Canada and the EU. They're very much aligned in many of their views in terms of maintaining and supporting an open, multilateral trading order. In the case of Canada, I don't think Canada can, for the long term, go head to head with the U.S. in terms of a tariff battle. So it certainly makes sense it's completely logical and good strategy to look at other markets and see how they're responding and to try to coordinate their responses with other countries, particularly and other groups like the EU, which is a significant market and can certainly absorb a few more punches than perhaps Canada can in the medium to long run.
So let's talk about Canada's positioning with the European Union. How much of our proportion of our trade is with them, and how much capacity is there to expand it?
Sure. Well, look, the Canada-EU trade relationship is certainly growing, and it's certainly grown, exponentially since the signing of the Canada-EU trade agreement, CETA, back in 2016. The numbers have gone up, but it still doesn't represent that big of a percentage of the Canadian exports. The European Union is Canada's second largest export market, but it comes well behind the U.S. The EU represents there's about a 200 billion two-way trade between Canada and the EU in terms of goods and services, but compare that with the United States, where it's $1 trillion between Canada and the U.S. So there's a big difference between the two markets. So there's a lot of scope for growth.
Could we hit $1 trillion with the EU if we just said, okay, it's all systems go, we're shifting away from the United States, we're putting all of our effort into the European Union?
Sure. Well, I think we need to set expectations. I mean, at the end of the day, the economic gravity between Canada and U.S. is very, very strong, and it'll be strong for a very long time. I think that, certainly we're going through some troubles now, and there'll be a repairing of that relationship. There has to be a repairing of that relationship. How that looks in the future, I can't say. But I think what is clear is that having, too much emphasis on the U.S. market, 70% of Canadian exports go to the U.S., is just not sustainable. It keeps Canada very vulnerable to these types of external shocks and pressures. And so while we may not reach $1 trillion, nevertheless, we can certainly aim to improve the 200 billion mark. And I think there's many ways it can and should go in that direction. So I'm very confident that we can grow that even more than we have in the last 7-8 years.
What are our biggest exports to the European Union? What exactly are we trading with them?
Well, it does vary. I mean, it's a very broad range of goods and services, depending on the EU market. But for the most part, we still sell a lot of raw materials. There's still a lot of potash that goes and other things like that. So it's still very much raw materials, a big focus on that. But again, even that could be an area where we can certainly improve, because the EU is definitely looking to Canada and other markets for a stable supply of critical raw materials, stable supply for clean energy, and Canada is well positioned to provide that.
Mark, let me ask you about yesterday's phone call between Prime Minister Mark Carney and U.S. President Donald Trump. There did seem, things could change at the drop of a hat, but it did seem that the tone was respectful. They both used the word, it's been cordial, that it was productive. And it seemed, at least from President Trump, there was no more talking of punishing Canada or Canada is so bad or 51st state or Governor Mark Carney. So could that shift the conversation at all in terms of all the trade and tariff threats we've been dealing with?
Well, I certainly hope so. It's certainly an improvement. But as you said, we don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. Having a good conversation is one thing. Having positive results is another. So we'll have to wait and see. I'm certainly optimistic that this relationship will be repaired. However, it doesn't change the fact that Canada still remains largely over reliant on the U.S. market, and that's something that I think we definitely need to look to rebalance. And the EU is there's not many natural markets that go that are similar to the U.S. in many ways. Again, the EU is not a replacement for the U.S. Nevertheless, it is a market of $20 trillion. It's got 450 million people. It's a big, significant market, and it's looking to Canada for solutions, not just in terms of critical raw materials and energy, as I've said, but other things as well, in terms of digital trade and AI, and also just moving towards a green and digital transition as well. So there's lots that can be done. Clean technology is another area, nuclear, of course, and carbon capture. So there's a growing list. And I think if we focus on those things and growing the market, as well as repairing our relationship with the U.S., I think Canada could be in a very good position in the time to come.
Okay, Mark Camilleri, thank you so much for your time and for your insights.
Thank you very much, Natasha. Great to be here.
Our pleasure.